Okay, thank you. Dear God, thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you for a time where we get to rejuvenate and remember who you are. Remember the work that you did in bringing us into this world and try to trace back what your original intention was with us. I pray that you may be with us through today's study, that we can take a glimpse into more aspects of who you are and how you operate. And I pray that you may bless this study, bless each and every one of us as we partake of the message from heaven. And I pray that you may be with me as well as I learn from everyone else's contributions and discussion points. This is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. 2 seconds, sorry. Okay. Yeah. Happy Sabbath. I pray that you all had a good week leading up to today. And if you didn't, then I pray that the Sabbath may be that resting point that you need. Um, so I guess there's two aspects to today's discussion, study. It's been a week now since the camp in Slovakia finished, so I'm hoping that each of you managed to watch those presentations. Um, and so the idea is that we would discuss a few elements within those presentations, one specifically, and then see how that translates into something else that wasn't touched on in those presentations, but I think they're related concepts at least. Um, so as always, I benefit from and um, need your participation. So please feel free to contribute, to message in the chat, um, or raise your hand, preferably. But if you recognize that I'm not picking you, uh, then feel free to just open your mic and speak. Um, so I guess as a foundation to that is a brief recap of those presentations, and then we'll go into a few of those elements within them. Um, if you did watch them, you would have picked up that it was there was a bit of time spent delving the delving into the idea of God and how God operates, the nature of God. And in turn, that should reflect the nature of humanity because they go hand in hand. As we use one to learn about the other, sometimes we use the nature of humans to learn about how God operates. And in turn, we can use things that we understand about God's nature to learn about how we were constructed and demystify some of the things that we've misinterpreted or misunderstood about how we were actually put together as beings. And the first part in that is trying to understand what the purpose is of us, of our beings in being created. Why did God need to create this species that are created in their image more so than all the other species that came before? Um, and so that question was brought to the class. So feel free to either regurgitate some of the ideas that were shared in those studies or share any other ideas that you've had as to what is the purpose of humanity in the universe, in this whole in the cosplay of all these different species interacting with each other. Why were we created?
God was lonely.
Okay, so God was lonely, and then
wanted a counterpart that was image of themselves.
So God is lonely, but God has all these other creatures. So they weren't lonely implies that they are alone. It's themselves. But we know that heaven was filled with angels. We know that there were other created beings on other planets and other galaxies. Why specifically humanity?
Because we're the most like God in our image, was made in the likeness of God,
Okay.
closest.
So this idea that God needed a counterpart is then explored further with this idea that we most resemble God, as apart from all the other created beings. We know that the angels have free will. We know that all the other beings have free will. So I guess this is something to think about. If free will is out the question as to being the defining characteristic that makes us most like God, um, what do you think aside from that makes us like God, um, other than free will? Any ideas?
Hello, Kate.
Yes, hi
How about
Ignatius.
the, how about the ability to create?
The ability to create, in what sense? Could you explore that further?
Uh, if I heard the question correctly, did you say, is there anything that relates us to God or that makes us sort of counterparts with God
Hmm.
as humanity? So I'm saying the ability to create in the sense that we reproduce and we are able to create someone in our image or in our likeness.
Okay.
I don't.
Uh, yeah, I like that idea. Um, so there's this idea of recreation that sets us apart, um, from all the other, or at least we know for sure that it sets us apart from the angels. We don't know what all the other created beings are created like. Do they reproduce? Did God fill those planets all at once? Did God fill them with two beings and they populated the rest of their planets? We don't know. But at least if we compare angels and humanity, we know that there's that underlying um, difference. So, are there any other thoughts?
Is relationship like a counterpart or something?
Yeah, so we were trying to uncover why specifically humans for that counterpart relationship. Why not God just have the angels as their counterpart or any of the other created beings as their counterpart? And Ignatius pointed out that there's this idea of recreation. We know for a fact that that sets apart the angels at least. So I was just wondering if there's any other characteristics that we can point to that make us like God in nature to be able to reflect that counterpart relationship. Um, yeah. So if there's no others, Ignatius, did you want to say something? I saw you
Yes.
unmuted for a second.
Something just came to my mind that animals can also recreate, can they?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly.
So,
So why not
what,
a horse?
what so you see, the thing is, what would really set humanity apart, particularly humanity?
Hmm.
Maybe, maybe you would say further to the ability to recreate. Humanity is then able to, you know, as this intellect that animals do not have,
Sorry, say
to
that again. I didn't hear that word.
this extended intellectual ability that animals do not have. Um, like for example, I would say that uh, in animal, in in the animal uh, creation,
Hmm.
they just have a baby, right? And that is all. Humanity is then able to, train that baby, nurture that baby, um, and input some certain principles regarding the environment, and over and above that, humanity have this uh, dominion over the planet and over the animals.
Okay.
So that, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to this follow-up question is how intelligent animals actually are, because we know that, when, for instance, an eagle um has progeny, that baby eagle doesn't just have an inherent ability to fly. It doesn't just know how to fly from birth. The parent eagles have to, through experience, teach that baby eagle, how to fly. And if it's not taught, it never learns how to fly. So there is that passing down of experience and teaching. And I'm
And
sure we can
nurturing.
recognize and nurturing
Yeah.
of all other created species, that there is this aspect of intelligence. Perhaps not to the degree of humanity. Yeah, I accept that, but there is that within them. Um, Charity or Blessing, I saw your hand come up.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, so something that came to my mind, there's a concept that even up to today I'm still grappling with. So if you ask me any questions about it, I don't have answers. But it's about how we as human beings are spiritual beings. I appreciate we're not the only spiritual beings. And what spiritual means to me is we are capable of appreciating and finding meaning in things that exist. So we look beyond the thing that exists and find meaning in it. So it can be, for example, this earth and the way it operates. We can understand how it operates, but we go beyond the understanding of how it operates to understanding why it exists and why we exist, and what certain things that do exist in our world mean. So coupled with that is, I think, the ability to form intimate partnerships or intimate long-term relationships in a way that other creatures are not able to. So I appreciate there are animals that have lifetime partnerships, but it's usually limited to, if I could say, survival. So you don't have, for example, an animal couple that has career goals. I'm just giving a simple example where, um, a rabbit couple say, I want to become the next something
Mhm.
in this life and achieve that. But human beings are able to form a very intimate partnership, you know, um, and have sex
Mhm.
in that partnership, which is a level of intimacy that at least angels do not have. And why I bring that up is because that intimate relationship that goes into every aspect of life, like even the most private parts of your life, gives you as a spiritual being, human being, the ability to appreciate the relationship that exists between the Godhead in a way that other creatures probably cannot share to the fullest extent.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
So there was a point that you touched on, is that humans are able to it's their relationships are not mechanistic, if I can put it that. It's not just do this and this will happen. That relationship between humans grows um into something better or something worse, dependent on the experience that they have. And I think you brought out an example of uh, animals who um, in a lot of their relationships, it's mechanistic, where recreation is part of it's this mechanistic approach, where a lion will have sex with a lioness and create progeny and go and do the same with another lioness in another tribe. And that just happens in that circle of nature, generally speaking. But it's this idea of growth through experience, growth in their relationship through experience that I want to pick up on, and which we're going to touch on further down in the study. So if we just keep that in the back of our heads. So once we know that, and then we shine a light on us as a movement, and we ask the question, what is the purpose of us as a movement? So not of humanity, but specifically us. Um, I've there's various answers that you can give to this question, but I've heard a presenter or presenters or people in discussions in the past um, bring up this idea that under the impression that we would go off and evangelize the world, um, that we needed to create this space or this movement that was safe for incoming people. You would call it a safe space for people who've suffered abuse, who have not had good relationships in the world, where they could feel welcomed and a sense of belonging. And so my purpose is not to undermine that, but it's to try and delve into what that would mean, what that should mean, not bringing into question the idea of evangelism and etc., but this idea of safe spaces. And we're going to go through, yes, the movement was not a safe space. I get that. So I was more so projecting into what it should have been, what it should be once all the tears are removed, if you want to call that. And I'm questioning that very concept itself. So in trying to create that, I wanted to understand if those intentions, while good, could have unintended consequences in getting to that point. So by means of introduction, that's what we're going to explore in our study. But before we get to that point, we need to understand God and how God operates with humanity and wider created beings. So if again you've watched Natalie, you had your hand up. Sorry, never saw it. Did you want to say something?
Oh, I would say just go. I already said in the chat that animals don't have the experience that humans do, and I think Charity Blessing, sorry, elaborated on that. And I wanted to say that through the ages, it will be the experience of the creation of God, us, the 144,000, that will be looked upon and talked about. You can't do that with animals or any others in the world, or not just the world, the whole creation
Mhm.
of God. The 140,000 will be talked about for ages, none others.
Yeah, agreed. So I guess to get to that question of understanding good intentions, unintended consequences with how we operate as a movement, um, I want to take a step back and build up to seeing those good intentions and possible unintended consequences by looking at the nature of God and how God operates and what God's intentions are when they create their government. So again, just a broad question of what do you think God's underlying motif or intention is when God creates or when God governs? Another way of asking this is, what is the essence of the law? And I don't want to say God's law, but if we separate it, what's the essence of God's law in government, in nature, in characteristic, etc. What's that underlying principle that you see or should see in all the decisions God makes or the ways in which God operates?
Love.
And we see that demonstrated in all inspired writing, that there's this idea that love perpetuates all the actions done by God and controls God in how they operate. So to, yep, a hand up. So, did someone want to say something?
I want to say something, but I don't know. Oh, I found where I have to put my hands up. Yeah, I want to say something about the love. It's like God wants to show us that if we love the natural thing, we can love him actually. So if we love the nature, if we love animals, if the way we will show our love to humans is the way, it's like a kind of expression of the way we have to love him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So again, drawing on this idea of using parables to reflect that relationship that we should have with God. God often brings up nature to demonstrate that, or our natural relationships, which we abuse, but when it goes right, that should reflect what that relationship should look like with God. So in that camp meeting, two aspects of how God could, should, or does operate were brought into tension. This idea that God punishes humanity, or this idea that God restores humanity. So just wanted to, again, peel the curtain and understand what those two ideas look like when God does work with humans, and is there a third option um, to what God's intentions, goals, or motifs are, while remembering what that underlying principle is. So just the dictionary or verbal description of what punishment is. What's the purpose of punishment? I'm not asking about God, I'm just asking in general. How do you see the purpose of punishment? Debbie?
Yeah, I was going to say before that, before you asked that question, I was going to say God teaches us moral standards, doesn't he, of right and wrong. And so he can't put that punishment until we have those moral standards of right and wrong,
Okay.
which his law brings out. And so he says, God says, this is right, that's wrong. We have free will. And if we go against a certain principle, against a certain law, then there's going to be consequences for that. I don't know how you're going to put all that in.
Okay. So I guess there's this underlying motif that we see reflected in the law, in the laws of nature, in the laws of God's character, of love, and that love means in seeking the best for the relationships that two people have, or that a community has, and etc. And so if you step outside of that, there's no longer love, etc., etc. So in approaching that and having that at the back of our minds, again, this isn't a question about God specifically, but when you think of punishment, whether it's a punitive act done by the government, whether you think of how you handle your children, or a head teacher handles pupils in a school, what comes to mind when you think of punishment? How do you understand that? Andres?
Yeah, so I understand it as someone did something wrong or an offense, and then punishment is retribution, uh, or a penalty for that offense.
Okay. So you see that there's this response that needs to be taken for a wrong action. And as I guess drawing out from what you said, there's this idea of upholding justice, that justice needs to be met, and it holds that individual accountable for their actions. That's the reason why you have punishment, if I understood you correctly. Um, Natalie, you wanted to say something?
Can I talk about God, or do you want to keep it
No,
secular?
just keep it. When I say, again, I don't want to distinguish between secular and God. I just want a generic
Well, we have to, because
answer.
they have different purposes.
we'll question that down the road. But
How do you want me
just
to answer,
thinking,
with God or
just a
with general?
generic answer. Generic answer.
I only want to
It's
speak about God. Thank you.
okay.
Can I
think
say
as well.
something?
Oh,
Yeah, Sidri, then Emma.
I remember at school, if we did something that, or made a mistake in our work, or didn't do it properly, or didn't listen, then we would get the cane. We would get a beating from our teacher. So that implied that what you did wasn't right.
So there's this idea that you need to be held accountable for not doing your homework or whatever
Yeah,
the action was, and so justice needed to be served, and so you were
yeah.
given a beating,
Severe punishment, I would say
punishment,
now.
whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the consequence of that, it involves, in different circumstances. It could be suffering, it could be loss, it could be deprivation, because of you doing the wrong thing. And so the idea is that it's meant to deter you from doing that wrong thing, again, and then protecting the community from harm. So in thinking about governments, if you were to think about jail in this manner, you would say that this individual is punished because they stole from society, and so you need society to be protected from you stealing again, or murder, for instance. And so in some cases, at least, this punishment can be final. So if you were to go way back and think of the death penalty, that punishment brings an end at its conclusion. It marks this final retribution for what you've done. So there's this idea of finality to punishment. So we're going to Isaline, yeah, got your hand up.
Oh, I saw you put the answer already, actually. But actually, the question you said is really deep, because I was thinking, like, when you beat someone, why don't you just tell the person that what she or he or whatever done is not good, like it's wrong. And sometimes people get beaten, or you know uh, why there is a punishment, why there is the act of the penalty for offense, and i was I was thinking about that, and I came to the point that it's like it has to mark your memory that you shouldn't do that anymore. And it is kind of an example for the other people as well.
Mhm.
So yeah, I was thinking about those 2 points.
Okay, thank you. Um, I guess I didn't want to delve into that specific example of beating a child. I have my own thoughts on that, but that wasn't what I wanted to get into. I just wanted to say what it is so that when we look at restoration and what the purposes of that is and the consequences of that is, we can contrast the two ideas. Um, but yeah, agreed, that this punishment can serve as this reminder, if you want to call it that, to others that these are the consequences of your actions. And that consequence is you realizing suffering or loss or being deprived something, such as going into jail, being deprived relationships in the outside world or career aspirations, etc. So then contrasting that, if we were to think of restoration, and how justice systems typically should operate, and we were to think of restoration with regards to the purposes of a being wanting to restore this person, and doing something to restore that person. We can see that restoration focuses more so on healing, on reconciling a broken relationships, in bringing things or people back to their intended state. And so there's this idea of repairing the damage that was done by this party. And so now we can go into God, Natalie, and see these two things being operated. So one of the ideas in those studies were that to understand how God operates, does God punish people for their sins, or does God restore humanity when dealing with humanity in the different changes that God brings to the environment or brings to their situation as a community. An example of that would be why the Israelites went into captivity. Was that to punish the Israelites, or was that to restore the relationship that the Israelites had with God? And so one of the suggestions was that we have to juxtapose those ideas. And so these two concepts seem like they are in tension. Not seem, they are in tension. This idea of restoring a relationship or humanity or punishing them. And so we have to force them together. And so when we force them together, what do we see? Um, yeah, you've got your hand up, Andres.
Yeah, so what I was gonna comment or yeah, is that I think also punishment can be can be used with, I'm gonna say, two different finalities. One would be to restore and one would be to if like make the other like justice, let's say, or retribute or a payment or suffering for a wrongdoing. So I was thinking that it's not always yeah, the intention behind punishment, if we just look at the definition, dictionary definition, can also be to restore.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I guess as you're pointing out, that you have these two ideas, this idea of justice being served and this idea of restoration. And so we can see that an action done by one can have the consequences of the other, of restoring. And that's what you get. You get a holistic answer when you juxtapose these two concepts. But there's a third, which I guess is tied to the second. But when we look at restoration, it's about bringing this being or this party or this community back to their original state. So if you have point A, yeah, at the bottom on ground zero, and you want to get that group or person to ground 7 at point B, you don't want to bring them, let's say they go off track. You wouldn't want to bring them back to ground zero to restore them back to their original place. So this concept I'm suggesting is a third, which is elevation. So it transcends beyond just mere restoration, and it fits along these two ideas. But its intention is to focus on growth beyond what that original state was. And so there's this elevation. So instead of restoring this party to their original state, you'd raise them up. So if we were to think of us as humans, you'd raise and lift up humanity, or God would want to raise and lift up humanity to a higher level of that relationship that they had, or their understanding, our understanding of how the world operates, how God operates, and it goes beyond what was there before. So there's instances where we see this demonstrated with how God has operated. We'll come to Egypt, but let's look at a few case studies, a few examples of how God has operated with their creation, to see what was God's intention, what did God want. So the first of those, in seeing how God tests us or tests their creation, is we see that first demonstrated with Lucifer. Um, and then when we answer these tests, we can see, okay, what was the whole point of having these tests in the first place for Lucifer, for Adam and Eve, and for humanity as a whole? Why did God feel it necessary to have these tests? And was it just a test as a consequence of sin? Is there more to it, I suppose? So thinking back at the timeline of events that led to the fall of Lucifer, um, what happened? What transpired? So we start at a point of harmony in heaven, where we have these two beings. Oh, sorry. Yeah, two beings. We have Lucifer and Christ. And on the surface, it looks like they are equal, in ranking at least. It looks like they're brothers because they operate, on the surface, they operate in the same way. And Lucifer sees this person, or this being, sorry, as an equal to them. And then something happens, um, where God has this God has this meeting with Jesus. And a question that's come to my mind is Lucifer and Jesus had been getting along side by side, so to speak, for a millennia. I don't know how much time had passed, if you can even quantify that, up until this meeting takes place. And Lucifer sees Jesus go into this meeting, with God and the Holy Spirit, and and Lucifer feels left out. Why do you think um, God and Jesus and the Holy Spirit had this meeting at that point? Because it was something strange to Lucifer. If they had done it before, Lucifer would come up to that realization before. So just going through the steps, I would propose that it was something that was never done before, when the decisions that were being made in the open. But here comes the situation where you have a private meeting and now Lucifer is hurt. Why did they have the secret meeting? Why not just let things carry on the way that they had been operating before to maintain peace and harmony? So there's harmony. Then we have the secret meeting. Why then? I don't know whose hand was first, but Natalie.
Don't know quite how to answer. It looks like a stumbling block, doesn't it? It looks like, God knew this was going to happen. But a test of worship and belief. It was a test for Lucifer, really, before anyone else was tested.
So you've pointed out that there's this test at this point for Lucifer specific, whether it was for Lucifer or for all the other angels, but we'll zone in for Lucifer, um, just for purposes of this study. So you've pointed out that there's this test. Carry on. And what's being drawn out from this test?
That Lucifer is not at the same level as Christ.
Why did God need to point that out then and there? Why couldn't God have done it? Well, okay, I don't want to ask why couldn't God have done it before, but why did God feel the need to point that out?
I think everybody has to be tested, and to think that if it had been done from the very beginning, if Lucifer would have known, it wouldn't have been a test as much as it was further down the line.
Yes.
Where Lucifer's
Again, just
character was able to develop.
digging into your answer, I guess the question is why the test? Like why test
Worship.
Lucifer? Pardon, sorry. So So you have this idea that test is to test loyalty.
Yeah, or who you worship, yourself or God, ultimately.
Okay. Andres, did you have another idea?
Yeah, so my answer would be to to show I'll summarize it in growth so that Lucifer can grow in that now God is showing Lucifer a new aspect of their personality or of their essence,
Mhm.
and Lucifer hadn't had that opportunity, but now they do, so like they can grow now.
Okay. Grow to do what? Why did Lucifer need to grow?
To to I would say grow their understanding of how who God is. In that, I would say Lucifer thought didn't see the infinite how infinite God was, and Lucifer thought that Christ was equal to themselves, and in order to they in order to appreciate that there's bigger things, they had to see that. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I got you. So ultimately, God wants to have a relationship with all the created beings, with everything that exists in the universe. That relationship will look different, because of different reasons, but God wants to foster loving, free-willed relationships with all these beings. And so I guess alongside what you and Natalie have pointed out is that God's going to test whether Lucifer is loyal to them and that relationship. But the second aspect, which I wanted to weed out, was this idea that for all created beings, God is going to do something to get them to elevate into having a better relationship with them. If you think of a marriage, for instance, you in your marriage, you're going to start off as a married couple, but over the years, what should happen is that your relationship just grows and gets stronger and stronger and stronger. Um, so and not just so that's the relationship aspect, but for that individual as well, to have a better understanding of the universe, for them to grow in knowledge. God is going to do something to help you develop in wisdom, in your knowledge of things, if you want to call it that. And it's interesting that God uses this technique where God finds a pressure point, something that they know is going to sting you or is going to sting that being, to see how they respond to it. And the hope or the intention is that that being grows, elevates, and becomes a better being for it. And so that's what happens with Lucifer. Fix fix them where it hurts, because God knows that these two have been operating side by side all along. And so I'm going to find something that I know is going to hurt your emotions, to see how you respond to it. And at the end of it, the hope is that you come off better from it. Your relationship with me becomes stronger, and you are a more holistic being, at the end of it. And after that, I can give you more responsibilities. In work, we often see that to get a promotion, you have to demonstrate those qualities beforehand, before you're given that more senior role, with more responsibilities. So there were responsibilities that God wanted to put on Lucifer's lap, but before God could give those responsibilities to Lucifer, um, God pressures Lucifer and makes them uncomfortable to see if they can handle those greater responsibilities. And I agree with what Natalie said, that it's this test of faith and trust in God. Um, but I wanted to explore the secondary aspect of that, is this idea that there's this growth and development that comes from finding a pressure point to something that individual has emotional ties to, and twisting their arm to see how they respond. And the hope is that they grow better from it. Susan, Isaline, and Natalie.
I was going to say it's to clear up Satan's misunderstanding of who God was, to give him a better perspective of the Godhead.
Yep, agreed. All that fits into this idea of testing Lucifer, but with the goal of getting them into a better state where they could handle these greater responsibilities that God had set out for them. Isaline?
So my question was why the test was for Lucifer and Christ, and why for not the other habitants? But I think I kind of understand the answer. It's like because it's the Godhead. So the Godhead, actually, I don't know how to explain it, but if you want to say something, just yeah.
I guess, so I had originally started with, was this test for all the angels originally? And it was just Lucifer that responded in a way that the Bible and Ellen White was the first individual to respond in a way that made them point out Lucifer specifically. But I would suggest, just thinking about all your answers now, that it was specifically targeted at Lucifer in this instance, because we know that Lucifer held the highest rank among the angels. And so, in having that highest rank among the angels, there were specific elements to that relationship that God had with this, we'll say, the leader of the angels, that God felt, okay, to give you more responsibilities, I'm going to twist your arm on this specific point because you see Jesus as your equal in ranking. So, would there have been another test for the other angels? I'm sure in the grand scheme of things that throughout the ages there were different things that God tested other angels with, and tested Lucifer with before, because if this idea that God wants, in this context, the angels to be better angels, if you want to call it that, then there must have been tests beforehand. Because my suggestion is it's this means of getting this created being into an elevated state that God operates by through experience. I hope that somewhat answers your question. Natalie, then Emma, and then Charity.
Do you think it was reasonable of Lucifer to question God why God hadn't tested Christ in the same manner?
Is that a question for me?
That's a question for anybody.
So your idea is, why didn't God test Christ? I don't know. That's a philosophical question, is can God test Christ? Because if someone is equal to them, because we recognize that God and Christ share that threefold relationship, can God even test Christ? Not talking about Jesus's experience here on earth, at least.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, and I agree with you. But I was just thinking, Lucifer must have been thinking at the time, because this is why he rebelled. Why am I the one having the great test? Why not Christ? Because where he was in the moment.
Did Lucifer even see it as a test that was specific to them? I guess those are endless questions that we can
But he
have.
did afterwards.
Yeah, after the fact, sure. And I guess that falls into this idea of Lucifer feeling isolated from this threefold relationship that he didn't feel before, and now he feels. His emotions are I'm going to say this badly, but toyed with. And so he feels left out, or sorry, it feels left out. And so they feel unfairly treated. But it's this, and I guess that's what I'm coming to, is that it's this pressure point And the more we see it, the more we understand that it's actually a pretty interesting method of getting a being to grow and develop, is finding that pressure point and pushing that button to get them to elevate. Charity, you got your hand up?
Hello.
Oh, okay. I'm
Hello.
confused.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. There's just two
Oh,
devices.
sorry. Sorry. Yeah, something's
Sorry.
going on the side. Sorry. But it is Charity who actually wants to speak. But I wanted to ask a question earlier
Mhm.
based on a conversation you were having about testing.
Mhm.
I've even forgotten the question now. I've forgotten the question. Sorry.
Okay, we can come back
Yeah.
to it in when we look at Adam and Eve. Maybe you can come back to it
Oh,
then.
I think I remember now. I remember.
Okay.
Yes. So my question was, when we talk about tests and God testing the creatures,
Mhm.
is it necessarily a test is tailor-made for each individual, you know, each individual person,
Mhm.
or tests are normally they have a corporate nature to them,
Mhm.
depending on your, I would say, your ranking
Mhm.
or position. Because with Lucifer, it would definitely target Lucifer
Mhm.
personally based on his rank and file.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering whether there's this intentional decision to say we are going to sit down and craft a test for Gabriel, a test for Lucifer, a test for Angel X, a test for Angel Y, can
Yeah.
even come to human beings. Or is it that, you've got this corporate test, and this is
Mhm.
the question, corporate test, which of course does impact everyone individually eventually, because you have to respond to it, but
Mhm.
it's designed in such a way that it's, if I can call it general purpose,
Mhm.
I don't know if that's a good way of describing it. So that is my question, that
Yeah.
is it necessarily that, there's always going to be a test for this person and it comes at this time, and then God will decide now it's time for us to test this person, and then
Mhm.
now it's time for us to test that next person until we finish the billions of creatures that exist, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. I get your question, and I guess um, that's why I wanted to draw out the second aspect of a test, that it's more so than this idea of testing loyalty of an individual to God. It's this idea of growth for greater responsibilities, if you want to frame it as to serve or not. And so I think that as you put it, it's this, you have a template of, let's just say, CEO of the angels. Whoever would have filled that role, whether it was Lucifer or Gabriel or I don't know, Angel Y, whatever the case may be, for that CEO of the angels to do more in God's government. They needed to grow. They needed to have the experience to get to that point to do that. So I don't believe that it's this specific individual test for the sake of testing. Um, it's this idea that there's a role that each either corporate body plays in the government of the universe or an individual plays in that government. And so, for that role to see its final fulfillment, God needs to create circumstances that get you to a point where you can fulfill that role better. And so it happened to be that it was specific to Lucifer's circumstances. But if anyone else had been sitting in that position, I think the test would have been the same, because the idea is that that role at least needs the testing, the role that that being plays. I don't know if that somewhat answers your question, or at least those are my thoughts towards it. Um,
Curtis, can I say something?
yeah.
I guess it's in relation to this question in a way, even though I had the thought came before Blessing asked the question, that we frame the whole thing like a test, and this is how we talk about it. But I'm thinking in terms of a parent, that when a child goes through challenges or they're growing, and you are encouraging them, say, to walk, for instance, and they're trying to walk and they're falling over and it's not good for them and they're not happy, but you know that ultimately it's good for them to walk. It's nothing about the parent proving the loyalty of the child or proving the worship of the child. And I understand we're trying to apply these concepts to God, so it may be different, but it's just a thought I had, that it's always for the benefit of the child, that you are encouraging them to do these things. And that's the aspect I think you're bringing out, that this was for growth for Lucifer. Ultimately, this is not about God. This is about growth for Lucifer, or for anyone, or for the other angels. So I don't know if that would, if we change our concept of this whole concept of testing, and I know that we are focused on the Sunday law test and the whole testing and testing all the way along in this message, but I think sometimes the way that's framed is very fearful.
Yeah.
And yet the way that you're emphasizing now, this growth for Lucifer, is all about self-sacrificing love. My beings need to grow. I need to tell them that we're actually the Godhead are equal. So God's got this dilemma, perhaps, that God has always treated everyone equal. So Lucifer thinks, if you approach it from that angle, that Lucifer is level with Christ. And God comes along and says, well, actually, we've treated you that way, but this is the truth of the matter. And we need to be truthful with you, and we need to come out with the facts here, or for whatever reason it's happening now, but that we've done it this way up to now for everyone's good, for education, for something. But now there comes a point where we have to give some more information out for everyone to understand us better. And it's nothing about testing Lucifer in that sense, but we've made it that because Lucifer rebelled against it and now sin came in. So there's something there about, it wasn't even for Lucifer, perhaps it was for everybody to see, oh, this is what God is like. And we've treated you all really well up to now, but this is the point that actually we're different, and we've got to show you that somehow. And there's something around, it's always for the benefit of others, not for themselves. And I think that's really important to look at when it comes to this whole idea of testing, because testing, even in the world with exams and everything, is always for your benefit. It's not for my benefit that someone goes through their GCSEs. It's for their benefit, to show them how much they know, for their achievement, for them to pat themselves on the back and go and get a good job, you could say. So it's all about them being elevated to a different position and growing themselves. And I think that's
Yeah,
the benefit.
I concur. And I guess that's why I was trying to bring out this idea of, I don't want to say turning us away from just looking at it as a test of loyalty, because ultimately the reason why we do look at it as a test of loyalty is because of this retrospective nature of looking at the issue. But if we were to think of it in terms of grand purposes, of who God is and how God operates, it's the second element which I think is the more important element to how God operates, is this idea of education and growth in the cosmos, in that relationship. And while I think there are circumstances around each situation, whether it's a governing body or an individual, the circumstances will differ across each circumstance. Why I think this specific story of going into council with Lucifer, I mean, sorry, going into council, the Godhead, and leaving Lucifer out, is specifically targeted at Lucifer and not the other angels, is because the other angels didn't see themselves as, well, I would think, didn't see themselves as high in that hierarchy, or they weren't high up in that hierarchy. It was Jesus and Lucifer that ran the show. The other angels had their parts to play, but they were lower down in that hierarchy. So that's why I think it was, in this story at least, it's tailor-made for that relationship specifically. There will be more generic ones, I agree. Where again, the term test, I think, is a bad word, because it's like a parent taking, and I guess you said it, taking their child to ride a bicycle. Is that they put them on the bicycle with two wheels, and it's not the parent saying, I want to test if you trust me or not. It's the parent saying, I want you to learn how to ride a bicycle. And so here's this scary thing that you're going to do, and you're going to come out better for it in the end. Of course, parables are limited, but I think it's more that aspect, more so than this idea of testing loyalty. And I think it's reflected in Adam and Eve as well. As we'll go to that next. So last two contributions on that. Charity and then Debbie.
Yes. Okay. I guess I initially I'd wanted to also talk about the issue of taste, but I wasn't sure if I should say it now or it would take us off or whatever. But anyway, I was just thinking about that idea or the issue of taste and how we conceptualize testing,
Mhm.
and how usually, like for example, when we look at a reform line and how at every in each and every dispensation we've had tests that come upon us, right? And I was just thinking to myself that is it an issue of God like sitting down and bringing out something that they are going to say, I want to see how far they go, or how committed they are to the message, or it's an issue of there's a plan that God wants to teach something to humanity and introduces information at a particular time based on the the dispensation or the information that has been discovered by humanity. And then you know when you have knowledge, yes, knowledge increasing in humanity, and certain things are introduced with each and every at every point or dispensation, right?
Mhm.
And then it impacts human beings because they are now being tested, and it becomes a test to us, because I think it's something that we once discussed. I don't know if it was all the tests or something, that it becomes a test to us because we are found wanting in that situation, how we are in a situation where we need to move from what we are used to, like for example from patriarchy to equality, because we're used to equality, but because of the increase of knowledge we are required to move from where we are. So it impacts us in different ways, like we have seen over time in the movement. It's difficult for everyone, but it's harder for some people than other people, depending on how much of those things they're holding on to and how much they need to let go of. And I was just thinking of it in the same way as well with Lucifer, that with this introduction of new light that came to them in connection with who Christ is, or it was something, it was a revelation to every angel, right? And they were all being going to be tested, or based on the information they had on whether they were going to actually accept what that revelation that they were given. But it impacted Lucifer in a different way than other angels because of where he was. So to me, I was looking at the issue of test as something becomes a test to us, depending on what we are holding on to, that we are supposed to relinquish, basically. And it becomes harder because of how much of that baggage we're carrying. I don't know
Um,
if that makes sense.
yeah, I got you. So ultimately, I think from what I gathered from what you said is understanding what God's end goal is and getting grounded in what that end goal is. And so if we go into Adam and Eve, I think it will tie into what you've said, is what that end goal for Adam and Eve was, or for humanity. Let's use, I'm gonna say Adam and Eve as symbols just to reflect broader humanity, humans, that creation is what was that end goal for us and or for God. And as we discussed at the beginning, it was to create this counterpart, um, this these beings that fully reflected me and that I could have in my councils to make decisions, to be my equal. Um, and so Adam and Eve are created as we know, as blank slates. They have the faculties that God has. They have the nature that God has. They fully reflect that. But they are blank slates. They're immature children. Humanity are immature children, and so humanity needs to get to a point where God feels comfortable um, giving us the reins, if you want to call it that, to make decisions for the cosmos. And so you have this test, as we frame it, set up with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And again, we frame this in the idea of God wanting to test Adam and Eve's loyalty to them, to God, to that relationship. That's the traditional view we have about obedience and this tree. But like we saw with Lucifer, we can and I think should see it as this step in their elevation and our elevation, to move from the state of blank pageness to a state of wisdom and experience that when all the other traits that would be necessary for a true counterpart relationship with God. And so they're given this choice, and we see this elevation through that choice, where Adam and Eve needed to exercise their free will, in contrasting this choice to do something with an ulterior choice to serve yourself in the universe, and whether they would align with God's will out of love, wisdom, etc., and not mere mechanistic approaches. Because for someone to govern, to be in those chambers where decisions are made, they needed to know how to govern through wisdom and out of love, and not just because God told them to do so. So it was an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity for them to actively choose the right thing, if you want to call it that, to serve beyond just themselves. And so there's other aspects of that elevation that you can draw out. But ultimately, if we think of that grand picture that we discussed at the beginning, that it is God's purpose is to get humanity, it's reflected in Adam and Eve, from a point of blank pagedness from A to B. And to do that, God sets up an environment or sets up a circumstance or a play in which they stress test Adam and Eve's relationship, knowing that this cooperating as a pair would get better outcomes. It was going to stress test them, and stress testing Adam, because Adam knows, or God knows, that Adam had experienced loneliness before. So when Eve makes the choices that Eve makes, and Adam is faced with a choice to go back to or fear loneliness, what will Adam choose? And ultimately, this whole orchestration, if you want to call it that, is beyond just loyalty to them. It's seeing how they handle, if you want to put it, how they handle pressure. Um, if they would pass this test, so to speak, they'd be better off for it. Not just that God gets to tick a box and say, okay, these people are loyal to me, but now, okay, I can trust that they will be good governors for what I have planned out for them in this partnership that I want to have with them. And then we spoke about, interweaved in all your answers is our test that we face here on Earth, whether it's the son-in-law test or Jacob's time of trouble, for instance. Ellen White speaks of that being a time period where gold is refined in the fire. We know that probation has closed, so there's no testing of loyalty being done anymore, because if you want to say it, the books are sealed. So what's the whole point of going through that time period? And I think that illustration emphasizes this point even more. So if anyone can give their understanding or share what they see the point of Jacob's time of trouble is, why not just end things at the close of probation? Why not just come? Other than what God is doing to I'm going to say it this way, the wicked, but what's the purpose of the people who are alive going through that as well? Why is it Jacob's time of trouble? Yeah, Natalie.
When I look down at the next harvest, Jacob's time of trouble, I see that there was still some earthliness and still some faith, some elevation, as you call it, some growth needed. And I think that was the same with the last Jacob's time of trouble in 2019. There was still a lot of growth and understanding about self and God's character and the message that was given.
Yeah, so I see that as the demonstration of the point that we're making, that it's beyond this loyalty to Jesus, beyond this loyalty to God. It's that God continually wants their creation to grow and develop in understanding of their character, in understanding of themselves, and etc. So that's tests, or at least how we look at tests and what the purpose of tests are. Another aspect that was drawn out in those camp meeting studies were these environmental changes that takes place on Earth, and two were marked out, at least in passing, but there's a third. So the first being when Adam and Eve fall. They move from the Garden of Eden and they move out to the Garden of Eden, but in that transition of where they're located, there's an environmental change that God puts on their creation. And thinking back at what we've discussed, I just wanted to at least start trying to answer that question because I think it was left open in those classes, of why God needed to change that environment. Um, and we're not going to read them now for purposes of because of time, but we know that this is the case, that God curses the ground in that story. And then we get a bit of insight into what that looked like and what that entailed in patriarchs and prophets. So a secondary question which we can think about is in that story we read about these curses that take place, and we read about this curse to the environment, and at least how Moses writes it, we read of this curse to Eve, and then juxta we compare and contrast that to this curse on I can't remember if it was Cain, not Cain, sorry. In the story of Noah, that curse. What's the son's name? Um,
Ham.
Ham. Yeah, in that curse. So we compare and contrast those curses, and we make the point that this is a prophecy in those two aspects, how it relates to Eve and Ham. But then we distinguish between that and this environmental change that God does as being an action that God is doing. So it's just a question that came to mind. How do we reconcile those two ideas? That a curse is not always this prophecy, a prophetic telling of what's going to happen, but it's God intervening and God actively doing something. And how can we prove that? So that's just to think about secondarily. But anyway, so we have this change of environment with Adam and Eve. And then when Cain sins, so Adam plus Eve, when Cain murders Abel, um, in Genesis 4, verse 11 to 12. And then further details given about that story in Patriarchs and Prophets, paragraph 78, paragraph 1 and 2. We learn more about God's intentions. So just going into that. And then the flood, sorry. The environment changes again after the flood. So thinking back at what we've discussed and how God operates with, in inverted commas, tests, we then ask the question, why did the environment change when Adam and Eve went from a state of pre-sin to sinning? What was the purpose of God doing that? Does anyone have any thoughts before I share my thoughts at least? either thoughts that you've pieced together from the studies that were done in the camp meeting in Slovakia, or thoughts that you've had separate to that. There's this curse on the ground, curse on the climate. Curse has negative connotations to it, so I'm not going to call it a curse, but there's this change that happens to the elements, to the environment. Natalie?
I was thinking more of like cause and effect, and it's the environment that restores God's people, obviously not God's people. I make that specific because it's not going to restore the others who rebel.
Sorry, you mentioned that it's a cause and effect. Could
You
you
said before sin.
elaborate that a bit more?
Did you say before sin and then after?
Mm-hmm.
It's changing the environment. So I was the
Who
cause of
changes the
sin.
environment?
I think it's already put in place, and the sin brings about the change. But obviously, when we look at the cells and stuff, or the plant, I think it was already, the thorns were already. If we look at a nucleus or around the cell, it's already there. If the environment has to change, but yeah, so I guess it was God in the beginning.
Okay, so God changes the environment. Yeah.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Okay. So that wasn't what I was trying to answer. Let's just say that as a fact, that God is the one that changes this environment. And now we are trying to answer why. So to Isaline, my question is, why does God change this environment from before Adam and Eve sinned to after? Richard?
It was a cause and effect. They didn't learn very well.
Sorry, I don't understand that. They didn't learn very well. You saying Adam and Eve
The
didn't
environment
learn
changed because from Adam and Eve's restoration, the firstborn was a total opposite to the Godhead, and the plan of salvation was implemented, and they did not learn those lessons very well. So the environment changed as a cause and effect from that initial transgression of Eve and Adam.
I'm struggling to understand what people are saying when they say cause and effect, because cause and effect entails that, something is done in that environment that brings about this effect. So when you say cause and effect, what is the cause? Who is the behind that cause? And what's the effect?
Eternity come to an end around the atmosphere of fallen earth. That's the effect of the cause of sin. So it's like 6,000 years were taken out of eternity, and now there was a plan implemented that had to go from the start to the finish, which will be, these tests come in and close of probation and time of trouble. So that's what I meant by the cause and effect.
Sure.
Okay.
I'm specifically
even though the individual, because it says the land of Egypt shall not escape. So the fallen earth isn't escaping. It's going to be purified by fire.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. I'm specifically zooming in on the environment, so not more so this idea. Yeah.
But people can be restored.
Agreed.
I was just going to
Natalie?
say, when you talk about the environment was changed because of sin, and the change of the environment was to restore Adam and Eve from the sin.
So you say because of sin. So God changes the environment because someone has sinned. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, because the only way to restore is not by punishment, but by restoration, and a change in the environment is needed.
Mm-hmm. Blessing or charity?
Yeah, I wanted to say the perfect environment was designed for a perfect plan, the original plan God had for creation. So the sin made it impossible for God to teach even Adam according to the original plan. And since now the plan of redemption had to kick in, the environment had to change to go in line with the lessons God now needed to teach about sin. I don't think a perfect environment would have taught the lessons about sin that they now needed to learn as people that had experienced sin. That's my thought.
Okay, so the original plan was get humans to a point where they could be my counterpart at a general level. Yeah, that's God's original plan. And so in environment A, in Eden, you have this area or these surroundings that God is going to use. And the first place where we see this lesson being taught is creating animals in pairings and Adam and Eve, Adam being created alone. And so there's a lesson that that environment is going to teach humanity about relationships. And so throughout, I don't know how long Adam and Eve spent in Eden, in environment A, if we're going to call that Eden, um, in the Garden of Eden. God is going to use that specific environment to help humanity grow and develop and elevate to get from point A to point B in that relationship that God has with them. And so just drawing in the elements that Blessing, Natalie, and I guess Richard touched on a bit, is seeing environment B come on, is that, okay, God recognizes that there's a secondary thing that I need to teach this pair or humanity, and that's about sin and the consequences of sin and how they relate to each other now that they choose bad choices, if we say that's what sin is. And so this environment A, as all three of you have pointed out, is incapable of teaching that lesson anymore. So now there's this plan of restoration that comes into it. So if I think of plan A as being elevation, that's what God wanted for humanity, to elevate them. Plan B is now God needing to elevate humanity while coupling that with restoring them. So when we started, I asked, okay, what does God do? And we asked, does God punish? Does God restore? Does God elevate? And my suggestion is that this idea of elevation is not lost in the plan of redemption. It's just that God needs to attach a secondary element to that, is this idea of restoration. So restoring humanity back to this point of harmony or innocence. But while doing that, they also need to be elevated, because what would the point be of going through these 6,000 years and just restoring them back to the original point that Adam and Eve were, of blank slates? God is going to use a bad situation for a good purpose. And so we see the shift or more aspects being attached to how God is going to relate to us. And so pressure points are put in place. So this environment becomes uncomfortable to humanity. But that uncomfortability or that discomfort is there to help humanity grow. And the same is said with Cain. So when you do have the opportunity to read Patriarchs and Prophets, those two paragraphs that I pointed out, Ellen White describes this in a bit more detail, that the whole point was that humanity sees these uncomfortable situations in the environment. They are pressured, humanity is pressured, just as Lucifer was, and they grow as a result, not just in their recognition of sin and that sin is bad, and so being restored to a point of innocence, but they grow as a result into a higher aspect of their characters, their nature. And so at the end, you end up at a point where, okay, now humanity can govern with me. So that was God's original plan, and God is still going to achieve that, just using a different tool to teach that lesson this time. So Natalie pointed out in the chat that God had no choice to accomplish these means. It was God's method in accomplishing these means. Andres, you got your hand up?
Yeah, so I was thinking um that about when we were talking about consequences and sin and all of that, and I think that this might be a question that or something I don't understand. That it seems in a way that God has to manufacture consequences of sin in the environment because sin itself didn't have consequences apparently. Um, so I'm wondering what are the consequences of sin itself without God's manufactured consequences, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think we see that in just relationships themselves. So sin is breaking down of relationships, if we can simplify it that way. So if for Adam and Eve and God, or should I say with Cain and Abel, that's the perfect one, is that the relationship breaks down between these two siblings. So Cain sins because they break that relationship, and the consequence of that is that Abel is dead, and now there's no person. And so at a broad level, the consequences are seen more visibly in those relationships itself. So now, as you're pointing out, God needs to demonstrate something to see beyond just that circle where those actions took place, that I want to imprint on your mind, as you've pointed out, that bad things happen when you make bad choices. And so I'm going to teach you something using the environment to show you that harmony, because I want to teach you about disharmony. So I'm going to juxtapose two things, or I want you to compare and contrast two things, a point of where things are in harmony. And so nature itself is going to be put into disharmony. So you have a mental marker. Humanity has a mental marker to know that if this is disharmony in that relationship, as the elements relate to the world, think about tornadoes, twisters, hurricanes, and etc. Um, that is meant to show you what your relationship shouldn't be. It shouldn't be this disharmony that you see in the environment. So it's this compare and contrast that the human is supposed to do as well. So it's a lesson book. So while I know Ellen White speaks about nature being a lesson book, and she specifically zones in on the beautiful aspects of nature. It's also those things that initially we may not see as beautiful. They end up being a lesson book as well, um, for relationships, for the relationships between humanity and those relationships between humans and God as well. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, or if you had any other thoughts to that.
Yeah, I think that does answer. Maybe I'm thinking also specifically about Adam and Eve, if we are able to see like how their relationship changed, or maybe the changes were not visible at that time.
I guess that was the prophecy that God has, that Moses at least writes as a curse, is that your relationship is going to change. And over the years of how men and women relate to each other, and hence patriarchy.
Mm.
There's
Yeah.
no direct narration of that interaction between Adam and Eve specifically, um, but it's that telling that the consequences of this, what just happened here, you're going to see play out in the years to come, in between how you two relate, that there's going to be this disharmony between you, um, between these two created beings. Yeah. So this was actually meant to be the introduction to a second section of understanding us as a movement and how we relate to thought and speech. But perhaps we can do the second part to this evening, if there's the chance, asking those that make those decisions, or next week or at some other time. But yeah, I guess okay, I'll conclude this part at least because I recognize that we're over time, is to see how God has dealt with humanity and how God does deal with humanity. The purpose of that is to see how we should deal with humanity and how it sounds funny, but how what brings about good outcomes. And so we see that in these two places, at least the two case studies that we did bring up in tests and environmental changes, that there's this work of growth that God wants for the beings in those circumstances, either restoring to the original point that God wanted that created being to be in, or to elevate, not or, in addition, to elevate them to greater responsibilities in their roles, whatever those roles would be. And that entails finding aspects that will twist their arms, that will pressure them and make them uncomfortable. Um, and I think it's interesting that specific aspect of it is that God uses an experience that is specifically uncomfortable to bring about uh, that elevation or that growth or etc. And so we'll close there. We'll close there for now and pick up the second part to this at a later time. But thank you all for your contributions. Obviously, this whole idea of tests and environmental changes can be explored even further. We just delved on the surface because there was a specific point that I wanted to draw out, but there's a lot more to these environmental changes that I think we can understand and should understand. But for now, that's it. So let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for being with us as humans. Thank you for being with me and my relationship with you. Um, it may feel counterintuitive for you to cause us pain, but evidenced by how you've worked with us thus far, it seems to be your chosen method to get us to being better people. And so we thank you for that, really. We thank you that you want the best for us. You want us to be your equals. You want to rule with us. But we know that to get to that point, we need to learn how to rule with you. We need to grow in wisdom, in stature, in understanding, in our emotional strength. And so while again it may seem uncomfortable and may seem counterintuitive, the end goal, at least for me, seems worth it. And so I thank you for all that you have done for us, continue to do for us, and the ways in which you lead us. Pray that it may be with us through the rest of the Sabbath. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you. I'll hand over to Cedric.